For 1.5 years, battles have been raging between the French and British empires. Fierce battles have been fought, forts have been taken, and entire populations have been displaced. This war, however, was still not an official one yet. France had every reason to declare war on Great Britain the entire time. Its reluctance, however, to declare war had procured valuable time for its navy to prepare and to keep the lifeline between Canada and the European mainland running. King Louis and his advisors knew very well that this war could not be won decisively in America or in the high seas. New France, with its population of roughly 70,000, could not hope to resist British North America's population of 1.5 million for long. The French navy was also a shadow of its former self. France was barely able to field 45 ships of the line. The navy was hopelessly outclassed and outmatched by the Royal Navy's 88 ships of the line. In addition to that, the French navy was severely lacking trained sailors and officers. Many of the noblemen that chose a military career preferred the army. It was only thanks to Naval Minister Marchault's intense effort that the French navy was able to operate effectively in 1756. His first course of action was to quickly win a decisive local victory to force Britain to the negotiation table. As a target, he picked the British island of Minorca in the Mediterranean. The island had belonged to Great Britain since after the War of Spanish Succession and was defended by the mighty fortress of St. Philip. The invasion of Minorca roughly coincided with the official declaration of war between Britain and France in May. 12 ships of the line and an army of 16,000 French troops set out from southern France and landed on Minorca on April 18th. After occupying the island, the French started to besiege St. Philip's castle from both land and sea. The British dispatched a squadron from Gibraltar of 10 ships of the line to save Minorca under the command of Admiral John Byng. His squadron was quickly reinforced by 3 ships of the line that had escaped the port of Mahon on Minorca before the French arrival, bringing his number of ships of the line up to 13. On the 20th of May, Byng's fleet finally reached Minorca. The French, seeing this, formed a defensive battle line. With the wind on his side, Byng decided to attack. Poor signaling, however, prompted his vanguard to get separated from the main body of the fleet. His lead ships took a massive battering from the French guns and sustained heavy casualties. With 207 sailors either dead or wounded, the British vanguard retreated. French Admiral La Galissonière did not press his advantage as he feared exposing his ships to a prolonged fight and thus weakening his grip on St. Philip's castle. A council of war was called on Byng's flagship, and after much discussion the decision was made to return to Gibraltar. St. Philip's, now without any relief coming, surrendered on June 29th. The Admiralty in London was fearing repercussions for the poorly planned rescue attempt of the fortress and was desperate for a scapegoat. Thus Admiral Byng was charged with breaching the Articles of War and subsequently executed aboard his flagship HMS Monarch. This was seen as a huge travesty of justice even by the standards of the time. The execution was even later referred to in Voltaire's novel Candide, with a famous line, "In this country it is thought wise to kill an admiral from time to time to encourage the others." Eager to end the war quickly, King Louis also sought a way to pressure King George on the continent. King George was not only the King of Great Britain and Ireland, but also the Elector of Hanover. Attacking Hanover might force Britain to the negotiation table before New France could be overrun. King George and his government were well aware of the potential threat. In September of 1755, Britain made a pact with Russia to provide subsidies in exchange for 40,000 Russian soldiers to defend Hanover in the case of an attack. The treaty, however, didn't mention France specifically as a potential aggressor. Empress Elizabeth of Russia saw this arrangement as directed against Prussian King Frederick II, whom she personally despised. All the more angered were the Russians when Newcastle in January of 1756 approached the Prussians with an alliance to defend Hanover. In the Treaty of Westminster, Britain guaranteed Prussia, including its recent conquest of Silesia, in return for Prussia defending Hanover. Newcastle used Prussian fears of Russia to pressure the Prussians to agree. Newcastle, in his naivety, hoped to stabilize the situation in Germany and deter France from attacking Hanover at all. He was, however, gravely mistaken. This only brought the anti-Prussian and now also anti-British coalition closer together. Britain still hoped to ally Austria, as she had done in the previous wars of the century. Austria, however, on the initiative of Maria Theresia's Chancellor Count of Kaunitz, was already dealing with France. Maria Theresia's primary goal was to regain Silesia. Prussian-British alignment brought Austria into the open arms of King Louis. Louis's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, was personally admiring Maria Theresia and despised Frederick. She wielded enormous political power at the French court, with many of the ministers being her personal protégés. In May 1756, an alliance between France and Austria was formalized in the Treaty of Versailles. Being promised part of Pomerania, Sweden also joined the alliance. Frederick found himself virtually surrounded by potential enemies ready to carve up his small kingdom. Deeming offense his best defense, Frederick mobilized his army in August of 1756. Instead of striking directly south into Bohemia, he opted for a surprise attack on the electorate of Saxony, which had been relatively neutral so far. The electorate was unprepared and quickly overrun except for the fortress of Pirna. Holding out for 5 weeks, the fortress bought vital time for the Austrian army to mobilize. Louis, in turn, having made all his diplomatic arrangements to attack Hanover, mobilized his own army. On the naval front, however, France was suffering massively due to the British privateers and the British blockade of the French Atlantic ports. Thousands of precious sailors were being captured on the coast of France every day. Merchants began flying foreign colors in order to not get intercepted by the Brits. In an effort to flip the script on the situation, Louis approached his cousin Ferdinand VI of Spain. Bringing the Spanish Navy of approximately 40 ships of the line into the fight would even out the odds with the British Royal Navy. Spain, however, was not keen on going to war with Britain again. The kingdom had enough trouble with modernizing its archaic economy and colonial system. Some in the Spanish government feared an overly powerful French empire as much as they feared a British one. Besides, France was now officially allied to the Habsburgs, which were Spain's rivals in Italy. Britain also took great care not to pull the Spanish into the fight. Spanish merchant shipping wasn't touched by either the Royal Navy or privateers. Spanish sailors were released when taken aboard French ships. Thus, French attempts to pull their Bourbon cousins into the war were fruitless. As alliances were forming and armies were being mobilized, the stage was set for what started as a border skirmish in the Ohio country to become a global war. Roughly at the same time as the Battle of Minorca took place, a new commander to replace the late Disco arrived in New France. The Marquis de Montcalm was a conventional commander and didn't hold the French Canadians and Indians in high regard. He believed that the North American war could be won just like a European one. The British should be repulsed by the walls of the mighty fortresses and if need be engaged in a pitched battle. He didn't think much of the irregular guerrilla tactics employed by the Indians and Canadians. The governor of New France, however, was the complete opposite. He grew up in Louisiana as a son of a governor and joined the Marines as a drummer boy at the age of 12. He knew that France could only hope to win against Britain and its vastly superior resources, employing the same tactics that had led them to victory against Braddock in 1755. Initially, however, the two men were getting along. Vaudreuil had already picked the target for Montcalm. He should attack the exposed Fort Oswego at Lake Ontario, held by the 50th and 51st Regiments of Foot. Unbeknownst to them, their advance against the British would be made easier by the Anglo-American confusion in high command. After the death of General Braddock, William Shirley was named as Supreme Commander until a professional replacement arrived. Although he was an excellent politician and lawyer, he was no soldier. The British government sought to replace him with John Chappell, the 4th Earl of Loudoun, a personal protege of Cumberland, but he didn't arrive until July. Meanwhile, Shirley made plans against Fort Frontenac and Fort Carillon. These campaign plans were detached from reality and outlandishly unrealistic, as no proper road had been built to Fort Oswego, and the two regiments stationed there were under strength. His motives for his campaign planning were also more political than military. The Carillon expedition, for instance, was entirely comprised of provincial militia, which didn't make much sense militarily, but politically it did. As explained in the last episode, regulations stipulated that no provincial officer could be superior in rank to a regular one. Thus, placing the two forces together would prompt all self-respecting provincial officers to resign. The New England legislatures also wanted the French forts threatening their colonies to be eliminated. Thus, the choice of the targets was also a political one. When Loudoun's deputy, General Abercrombie, arrived in June to take over command, he saw this chaotic state of affairs and ordered a halt to all offensive operations. Meanwhile, Anglo-American fortresses, which were supposed to protect the frontier settlers, were becoming large targets for Indian raids. One grueling example for this was the Delaware raid on the small frontier fort, Fort Granville, on the Juniata River in July. All settlers that had escaped to the fort for safety, as well as the fort's garrison, were either kidnapped or murdered. The French forts, in contrast, had an offensive strategic value as well as a defensive one. French forts attracted massive amounts of Indian raiders from far into the western prairies. Frontier areas were left desolated after being raided repeatedly by the Indians. This prompted the colonies to dedicate even more soldiers to the frontier defense. Thus, in all of 1756, Virginia and Pennsylvania were unable to contribute any troops to the offensive operations. Meanwhile, Montcalm had a free rein in attacking Oswego. Oswego consisted of 3 fortifications at the bank of the Oswego River. In the center lay Old Oswego, which was defended by a hornwork to its landward side and was open to the shore. On the east bank lay Fort Ontario, a small tributary fort meant to stop the enemy from deploying to the east. West of Old Oswego lay another tributary fort that was so poorly built it was named Fort Rascal by its defenders. None of these forts were either well built or positioned. East and west of Old Oswego lay 2 hills. An enemy taking either of those could have easily fired into the fort from above. In the afternoon of August 10th, soldiers from Fort Ontario spotted one of their comrades dead and scalped on the ground near the fort. As the local Seneca Indians refused to cooperate with the Brits, the garrison was clueless of the French and Indian whereabouts. On the next morning, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mercer, sent a small armed schooner to scout the lake's shores for the enemy. A mile and a half away, they quickly spotted a massive French camp with 3,000 soldiers ready to besiege the outpost. Montcalm had brought with him 1,300 regulars from the regiments of Baen, La Sarre and Guyenne. In addition to that, the Canadian militia and Troupes de la Marine contributed 1,500 men and allied tribes 250. By late afternoon, the scouts were beginning to scale the trees around Fort Ontario, shooting the garrison from above. On the next morning, the French arrived in force. The French engineers started digging trenches and establishing artillery platforms in point-blank range of Fort Ontario. Mercer, seeing this, knew very well that the garrison the next day would be annihilated and decided to abandon the fort in the middle of the night. Montcalm, waking up to an abandoned enemy position the next day, moved his artillery on top of the hill on the east bank. The east side of Old Oswego was entirely open, as all defenses were built to deflect an attack from the west. What followed was a devastating cannonade from the French guns, tearing apart the blockhouses of the old trading station and killing a substantial number of the garrison. Mercer ordered the cannons on the hornworks to be turned to fire upon the French on the hill. The British guns, completely lacking the parapets to protect them as they were facing the other direction, were obliterated by devastating French counterfire. After most British guns were silenced, Montcalm made his soldiers cross the Oswego in canoes. When Mercer saw the French approaching, he decided to abandon Fort Rascal too. As the French siege lines were closing in, the bombardment continued with a devastating effect. The next day, on the 13th, as Mercer was trying to organize a coherent defense in the hailstorm of French lead, a French cannonball cleanly ripped off Mercer's head from his shoulders. Command fell to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Littlehales. Just witnessing his predecessor's brutal death, he lost all hope. 1 hour after Mercer's death, he surrendered the fort to Montcalm. Montcalm was furious at Littlehales, for he deemed his token resistance as dishonorable. Montcalm denied the British the honors of war. All inside the fort were to be made prisoners of war. All he promised was to spare the garrison from the wrath of the Indians looking for scalps, loot and captives. A promise, he would soon learn, he wasn't able to keep. The Indians were furious when they learned that they were to be denied the spoils of their conquest. In the afternoon of the same day, the Indians broke into the fort's hospital and started killing and looting indiscriminately. French officers were trying to stop the killing as best as they could. Montcalm was furious at his Indian allies, seeing the breaking of his earlier promise to protect the prisoners as derogatory to his honor. In an effort to calm the Indians, he offered to buy back some of the captured British prisoners. By the evening, violence ceased. In the entire massacre, 100 to 130 Americans got killed. 1,500 became prisoners. In addition, the French captured 9,000 barrels of provisions and all the fort's cannons and mortars, 3 warships and a high number of whaleboats. Although a great victory for Montcalm, his feelings were tainted by the massacre he failed to prevent. He came to disdain the New World and its inhabitants even more, a disdain that to his own detriment would stick with him for the rest of his life, a common pattern for European officers serving in the New World. His aide-de-camp, the Marquis de Bougainville, remarked, "The air one breathes here is contagious, and a less long sojourn makes us acquire the vices of a people to whom we communicate no virtues." Thus, 1756 came to a close with another French victory.